Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our presentation, The Modern Board Director, Conversation Around Excellence in Governance, presented by Lisa Bouget from Santa Clara University's Levy School of Business in collaboration with Ivy Exec. My name is Mariana. I'm on the higher education team here at Ivy Exec, and I'll be helping to moderate today's session. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions to our presenter, which you can do using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We do encourage questions during the presentation, and we will also have a formal Q&A session during the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. And now, I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Lisa Bouget. Informed by her belief that the private sector can and should play a major role in building a more sustainable economy, Lisa drove a seismic shift in her work 2 years ago. From the C-suite at Stitch Fix to supporting founders and businesses that dwell at the intersection of her values and deep consumer experience, Lisa now works exclusively in support of social equality, wellness, and climate action. Catalyst, connector, creator of possibility, Lisa serves on 3 for-profit boards as independent director, advises a number of founders, teaches, and invests in people and organizations that work in support of the things she cares about most. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Lisa.
Thank you so much, Mariana, and hi to everyone. We have an incredibly strong turnout today, and it is a true privilege to be with you for the next hour in conversation about governance excellence, a topic that I have come to care deeply about. Mariana, thank you for the kind introduction. I am an alum from Santa Clara as well, and with that, it has been a true pleasure to be able to work with Santa Clara's Silicon Valley Executive Center on a number of things, but importantly and germane to today's topic, with regard to a corporate board readiness program specifically focused for women in the past 2 years. I helped to create that program as well as I facilitate it. We're now 3 cohorts strong and we'll launch the 4th cohort next month. A couple more things about me before we get going. Prior to doing the work that I do now on boards, advising, and investing, I spent my career in the consumer sector. And I feel so fortunate to have worked with progressive and certainly world powers as it relates to brands and businesses that truly defined retail along the way. Most recently, Stitch Fix, and prior to that, Nike, Patagonia, and Gap Inc. The work that I do today on boards is particularly meaningful to me because I have chosen to support companies and leaders that are working in support of the things that I care about most. We'll talk about cultural fit in a bit here, but I would encourage each of you as you reflect on your participation or aspirations to be on boards to think deeply about the types of companies that you support when one does work that is best aligned with your own values. True magic can happen. Mariana, thank you for being with us today to facilitate. Mariana will be doing a number of things along the way. She'll be monitoring the chat. She will be launching our polls, and she also will be helping me keep track of time. I definitely, I think because of my passion, can talk for a long while on this topic, but I want to make sure that there's time for you all to ask questions. So to that point, I will be spending about 40 minutes on content, and then we will reserve at minimum 15 minutes for you all to ask questions of me. We will wrap specifically at the top of the hour, though I'm sure we could have great conversation for the balance of the day, but out of respect for everyone's time, we will wrap promptly at the top of the hour. Before we dig in, I'll just turn it back to Mariana. Anything you want to add before we get going?
No, we can kick things off. I think we're ready.
Okay, cool. Great.
Perfect.
So as kind of with any presentation, I find it particularly important to get a sense of who's in the room. And we're going to start off with a couple polling questions so that we can have an appreciation of who all is gathered here today. I take it that you are certainly galvanized by your ambition, that being here and making time for this conversation says a lot about that to me. But I do have two specific questions that we will launch now by way of a poll, one at a time. And you'll have about 20 seconds to answer each of them. So here comes the first question. Mariana, please go ahead and launch it.
It is up right now. Please describe the role you play, if any, currently on a board of directors. You have 5 options. Feel free to answer, and we have about 30 seconds. Then I'm going to close the poll, but it's still in progress, so let's wait a bit more. Give audience a few more seconds. They're still voting. Okay, I think we're going to close it now. So the results are as follows: 14% chairperson, 28% independent director, 11% board observer, 22% C-suite, and 25% director manager.
Excellent, thank you. That's super helpful. Listen, we are going to cover a lot of territory today. My hope is that regardless of the role that you play, you're going to take away some key insights. But I think it's also helpful for each of you to get an appreciation of kind of the continuum of experience that we find ourselves gathered with here today. So thank you, Mariana, for facilitating that. We're going to do one more just to get a little bit deeper on the topic. And that is going to launch now, here to about 30 seconds.
Correct. It's up. What is your primary motivation for joining today's webinar? Feel free to answer, and we're going to do the same for the next 30 seconds. Give them a few more seconds and I think we're good to go. Okay, I am closing the poll now. So the answers are as follows: 59% aspire to serve on a board of directors in the future, 13% currently pursuing a role, 19% currently board director, 5% CEO founder, and 3% other.
Excellent. All right, great. So diversity is the name of the game, and we definitely have it with these attendees in lots of ways, including truly global representation here. Thank you, Mariana, for helping us better appreciate just exactly why people have carved an hour out of their day to be here. Okay, so let's get rolling. Okay, so here's how I have structured the content. We are going to touch on the essential responsibilities of directorship. For some of you, this may be in review. However, it is vitally important to have a core understanding of actually the fiduciary responsibility that comes with being a director. We're going to talk about how to maximize board effectiveness, and very importantly, talk about the rapidly changing landscape and expectations of being a board director. My goal for each of you, and hopefully your goal for yourselves, is at the end of this session, you will have a greater sense of how to lead knowledgeably, strategically, and effectively to maximize your board's impact. And by the way, that's regardless of the role that you play, whether you are a contributor, a chairperson, a board director, whatever it is. And of course, leadership, as always, is not specifically to the chairperson, but we can all play a better leadership role in our contribution. So let's get going. Okay, I believe dearly, and certainly it has been true, fortunately, in my own board experiences, that high functioning boards make companies and those companies' leaders better. But of course, that doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen by default. It has to happen only with clear intention, roles and responsibilities, and process. And we're going to get into kind of each of those parts today. Interestingly, and frankly, a little bit scarily, I had no formal board training when I entered my first board seat. And the only thing that was said to me ahead of time was this phrase that you may have heard yourselves: nose in, but fingers out. Here's the thing, that's generally good advice, right? Because what makes one eligible to be a board director was that they've had some level of success in their career, albeit in, operationally speaking, or having developed a high level of functional expertise. And that's all well and good. That's what got you there. But that certainly isn't what you're being asked to do when you enter a board director role. Management, of course, of the company is the responsibility of the executive team themselves. So that's great. But the fact is that ultimately the fundamental responsibility of any board is that they ultimately are holding the executive team accountable, monitoring performance, and then also making sure that they're doing that in compliance with regulations and also the law. Now, that's a little black and white and frankly, a little bit dry, but it is part of the fiduciary responsibility of a board director. But the fact is that the way in which that work happens is changing pretty rapidly. And increasingly, our board's focus is becoming much more about long-term value creation, specifically with regard to both the interaction and the development of long-term strategic plans and future-oriented risk assessments. This has always been part of the remit of board work, but certainly in this crucible moment that we find ourselves with regard to COVID and the pandemic, the need for longer-term thinking and risk assessment, I think, has come to the fore, and there's a great deeper appreciation of the importance of that in the responsibility of boards. Okay, I'm going to kind of fly by this next piece, but it is important. Okay, ultimately, as a board director, you have fiduciary responsibility ultimately to work on behalf of the company's best interest. That is a legal responsibility, and it means that one is acting in good faith, with care. I'm not going to read all of these bullets, and in a reasonable manner that, as I've said, is working in the best interest of the company. Okay, it is a legal responsibility. Ultimately, those responsibilities are characterized by two duties: the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. I am not going to go into great depth on these topics. We could do so through the executive program in our board readiness program. But what I want you to know at a high level is the duty of care essentially is to say that it is your responsibility to obtain adequate information and make thorough considerations when you are making decisions on behalf of the company. A dear friend of mine, actually a fellow board member, a peer, basically characterizes the duty of care as "thou shalt not be sloppy," which is kind of like a fair way to put it. That's the duty of care. The duty of loyalty is about acting in the best interest of the company and also ensuring that one, as a director, is free from any form of conflicting personal interests. Okay. Liability and the duty of loyalty really comes from having a sustained or systemic failure to exercise any form of kind of reasonable oversight. All right, duty of care, duty of loyalty. A couple of key things about each of these duties that isn't often written or taught. The duty of care cannot be delegated. So what do I mean by that? Let's just imagine a hypothetical situation whereby you are a board director and it has come to your attention that, I don't know, say the CEO is creating a hostile work environment or is thought to be creating a hostile work environment. As a director, it is your responsibility to dig in, to find a deeper understanding of kind of the allegations, and ultimately to bring that to the board to decide what to do. You cannot, as an example, ask the head of people and culture to launch an investigation, report back their findings. Okay, so the duty of care cannot be delegated. The duty of loyalty, as I've said, kind of has two components. One is about acting in the best interest of the company. The other is freeing yourself from conflict of interest. And kind of the rule of thumb here is when in doubt, disclose it, right? So I'm sure that you all have very full lives with lots going on besides your board work. And it often can come up that there are situations whereby you may have an interest or a leadership position or some form of influence in a situation that could somehow be connected with your board work and that company. When those things come up, it is definitely advised that you disclose that to the chairperson or the CEO, if the CEO is the chairperson, just to make sure you're covered. Okay, so two kind of helpful tips on the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. Oops, I'm sorry. I think that I just, okay, here we go. I just spoke about, in a bit of a way, the structure of boards, but I do want to take a moment to say that there are two common structures that take form in boards. One is whereby the CEO also acts as the chairperson, and you can see the cascading organization underneath on the left hand of the slide. The other way in which boards are most usually organized is that there would be an independent chairperson and the CEO would act on the board as well as the cascading hierarchy that you see on the right hand of the slide. I'm sure there are other ways, but these for sure are the most common. And the way in which a board is organized can also change. Oftentimes in more nascent companies, maybe startups like some of the ones that I work with, in kind of early days, the CEO acts as both, also as the chairperson, and then perhaps as the company becomes bigger, the team becomes bigger, the size of business becomes bigger, that form can change. There are four essential areas of responsibility for the board's focus. In no particular order, they are, importantly, CEO selection, evaluation, compensation, and succession planning, oversight of regulatory compliance and risk assessment, as I've talked about, oversight of company operations, financial performance, and reporting, and last but certainly not least, oversight of corporate strategy. Now, the form in which the board tackles these areas of focus can very much change depending on, here too, the size or the stage of the company. That is to say that enterprise and certainly public companies are actually mandated by the SEC that they have 3 committees that are working in support of these areas of focus. So the Nominating and Governance Committee is responsible for the CEO kind of oversight and also succession planning. The Comp Committee is responsible for actually all things compensation related. So the CEO there too, but also the entire company. And then the Audit Committee is the third required committee by the SEC for public companies, has oversight to all financial reporting. Okay, so 3 mandated committees in public companies in the US. I should actually say, I was going to say it in the introduction, all of the content that I am sharing today is based on US board directorships. So we have an incredibly well-represented, literally global audience with us here today. But I want to be clear that my expertise and certainly my broader knowledge of the director landscape is very much US based. Okay, so 3 committees in public companies. And the fact of the matter is that in smaller companies, private companies, startups, generally these 4 areas of responsibility are covered off by the board in its entirety, simply because things are kind of getting going, and over time, the organization will continue to evolve. All right. As you can imagine, those 4 areas of responsibility are no joke, right? Like those are very kind of high levels of responsibility that a board has. And equally no joke is the time commitment that one is committing to when they accept a board role. Now, interestingly, the shape of that time is changing a lot and really, really quickly. However, as you can see on the right hand of the slide, there's a breakdown. It's about a year and a half old, 2018 date stamped, with regard to how directors found themselves spending their time on their boards. And that amount of time equates to about 29 days a year. So big commitment. But the reality is, and again, especially right now in the middle of the pandemic, boards are finding that the old way of working just isn't well suited for kind of the current demands and rigor of board responsibility. On the left-hand side of the slide is a quote that comes from the National Association of Corporate Directors Governance Outlook Study. But basically, they just said, listen, like the old way isn't going to work anymore. We need a much more fluid way for boards to operate. And for those of you that are currently on boards, my sense, and I know I have experienced that, is that even in the last 8 months or so, the way in which you've engaged with your board work has changed dramatically. So a lot more frequent meetings, shorter meetings, more real time. Of course, a part of that is circumnavigating the challenging times that we find ourselves in. But I have a very deep sense that many of those practices will stick, frankly, because it will lead to better outcomes. Okay, so I touched a little bit on committees, but I want to go back to that for a hot second to say that I think it's true that the real kind of work on boards gets done in committees. That is to say, quarterly board meetings are important, don't get me wrong. There are very important conversations and reviews that take place in those quarterly board meetings. But really, like the depth of the work does happen in committees. And for those of you that are not currently on a board, I would encourage you to learn more about each of the committees and think carefully about where your superpowers best plug in. Many of you shared that you are aspiring board members or actively seeking board seats right now. And of course, so much of the search process, like any other, is about identifying from the company's perspective what skill sets they need to fulfill on their board role, and then finding the candidate that suits that. But a part of that, and actually a large part of that, is getting crisp on your own kind of distinguishing skill sets and how they would potentially plug into the committee organization that that company has, and where the greatest value add could be. Of course, like any team, carefully thinking about the composition of one's board at the highest level is very, very important. And intentionality and strategically thinking through, in the case of kind of a current board membership and what needs to evolve, as well as kind of, you know, future skills to be brought in, is really the name of the game, especially right now. I'll get into that in a minute. But so a couple of things to remember would be, one, certainly it is the responsibility of all companies, ideally, to cultivate a board that represents all of its constituencies. What does that mean? As I read that out loud, that kind of feels like code, but it's not at all. What does it mean? It means have a diverse board. It is every board's responsibility to represent all of their constituencies. Sadly, that is very much not the case today in the US, although there are some bright spots. Certainly with legislation such as California's SB 826, we are making great inroads with regard to greater female representation on boards. There's also some legislation underway, as an example, in Illinois, in support of Black and Latin participation in boards in terms of the same type of SB 826 legislation. There's also in California now some legislation underway with regard to greater diversity of boards with regard to sexual orientation. But the point is, if you're on a board, look around the table, and if you do not have true diversity with regard to your stakeholders represented around that table, you have some work to do. On the other hand, if you are an aspiring board member, be clear about kind of, that aspect of the companies that you seek to be on boards with, and also be strategic about kind of how you can kind of work with those realities to gain a position. Ideal board members have what's called quad capabilities. Okay, so this, whether you're an existing board member or an aspiring board member, do a little bit of a gut check here. The quad capabilities are that every board member should be independent, have expertise, as we've talked about, have bandwidth, and be clear about their motivations. I think the bandwidth and the motivation, number 3 and 4, are worth going into. Be honest with yourselves. As we said earlier, the commitment level of being a board director is serious, right? I mean, on average, if that's 29 days a year, that's a pretty big commitment. And so having bandwidth is clearly important to doing one's best work. The last one, motivation, be clear about your motivations. Mariana mentioned as an example in my introduction, my motivation for doing board work is to support companies and founders that are working in support of the missions or the things that I care about most in the world. That happens to be, in no particular order, wellness, social justice, and climate action. Those are my 3 things. You'll have your own, but being really clear about why exactly you want to be on a board is essential. The average board tenure is 7 to 10 years. So when you make a commitment to be on a board, this is a long-term engagement, so to speak. And being clear about why you're doing it is really central to success and satiation along the way. One best practice that I would highly recommend, whether you are a new board member or an existing board member, is to have some form of a formalized assimilation process for new board directors, someone that's able to kind of usher them in, kind of give them the rules of the road, so to speak, but not take up time in a board meeting. So I know for me that was greatly important. And if that best practice doesn't exist in a company where you find yourself as a new board director, request it. And then very importantly, certainly boards are increasingly being held accountable to their actions. That can be done formally through type performance reviews, but importantly, that can also be done informally. And certainly it is my experience that a best practice is to formalize board feedback, both kind of in the formal sense, but importantly in the informal sense as well. I'm doing a check on time to make sure we're moving through this. Okay, I think we are. Okay, okay, Mariana, we're good. Okay, so an engaged and high functioning board is certainly key to the winning offense. And as much as the makeup of the board is crucial, like we've just talked about with regard to diverse representation, so too are the cultural norms that are established within the board to ensure kind of optimized outcomes and potential. So some key things to be thinking about are to make culture and role expectations explicit. That's first and foremost of the board themselves, but very importantly, to communicate that also to the internal team. Because here's the deal. I know when I wasn't on a board, as an example, when I was at Stitch Fix, I obviously participated in board meetings and knew our board, but I didn't actually know kind of the specific responsibilities for each of those board members. And I think the last thing anyone wants is for that to feel like a black hole, especially in today's world with regard to increased expectations for transparency. So making those expectations explicit inside and outside the board is super important. Kind of with that, committing to direct, timely, and transparent communication, again, both inside the board and to the team at large, is also key to creating positive culture amongst the board. Designing a reporting format that answers to the board, but also benefits the business. All right, this I mostly put in here for smaller companies. This might be startups, this might be private companies that don't have kind of the mandated expectations of public companies. But I always feel like the best board meetings are the ones that actually create the opportunity for the executive team to learn something new by virtue of making the time and taking the time out to dig deep into specific topics. And while it's true that that's in part to answer to the board, the real value add is that the executive team has walked away with an insight, and better yet, an action plan in order to make their business or their consumer experience, or both, better. So that's very important. Another key thing to creating a high functioning board is to make executive sessions a part of the process. So what does that mean? For those of you not on boards, an executive session is a kind of closed door meeting with the board only. This serves two purposes. Certainly it serves as a confidential setting to be able to address important topics, but it also creates the opportunity for the board to establish a rapport and a level of trust that might not otherwise be possible in a slightly more kind of public or larger format. And then last, but certainly not least, minutes matter. What does that mean? Every board meeting and interaction should be documented in the form of minutes. As we started at the top of the hour, as a board director, you have fiduciary, that is to say, legal responsibilities. And part of that responsibility is ensuring that everything is documented. And that if a situation arose where you needed to go back to understand exactly what happened, what decision was made, who said what, etc., that is well documented, and that you find yourself in a position to be able to unearth whatever would be required in that moment. Okay. So we talked a little bit about how to establish a high functioning board through culture. Now, interestingly, there are lots of reasons, right, to establish a positive culture. One, it's just more fun. But the other thing is having a strong culture actually makes a board crisis ready. I'm sure many of you have experienced that for better or for worse over the course of the last 6 months or so. Just as an example of how quickly things have changed. In 2018, I was doing some research on the topic, and you can see on the left hand of the slide, somewhere between 65 and 73% of board directors either had experienced a crisis or felt sure that they would experience a crisis. I'm pretty sure if you ask board directors today, 100% would say they expect it or that they're in it, of course. But the reality is that historically speaking, companies experience, albeit not a pandemic, one crisis that's specific to their company every 4 or 5 years, okay? The expectation going forward is that that will actually increase over time. And that's for a whole host of reasons. As an example, global warming as one. We'll talk about some other risks here in a second, but just remember that creating a strong culture isn't only for all of the warm fuzzy things, but actually, practically speaking, will really matter when the rubber hits the road in a crisis. All right. So there are some very important shifts happening in governance. If you remember a few slides back, we talked about the 4 essential areas of focus for a board, one of which was strategy. That is becoming increasingly important. You can see on the model kind of to the right, the way in which kind of governance is moving. With a focus on strategy and risk assessment. But here's the deal. Deeper, more proactive board engagement with management, is quickly moving to strategy and risk. I talked about that in the beginning, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second. There's also increased internal and external transparency about the workings of the board. I incorporated that in best practices a few slides ago. There is much more rigorous accountability currently happening with regard to the board themselves. And so we talked about kind of both the importance of formal feedback and also informal feedback for board directors. And then lastly, the essential nature of board makeup representing the breadth of its company's constituencies is actually moving from, in terms of like the general zeitgeist, from a nice to have certainly to a necessity, not just for the socially responsible reasons, which obviously are very important, but frankly because it makes for better results. That is a known fact. And so think of it as a competitive advantage as well. In order to stay relevant, it's a must. Okay. We talked a little bit about strategy and the increasing importance of strategy a few minutes ago. Check this out. 86% of all directors indicate that over the next 5 years, their company's existing strategies will become completely irrelevant. This is a statistically significant, and I mean that both kind of literally and figuratively, data point. But it comes from the NACD's governance survey, which just wrapped up a few months ago. So it's a current statistic. But with the onslaught of risks that are facing companies at a macro level, the reality is most companies need to do massive retooling on their long-term strategic plans in order to ensure relevance, livelihood, and certainly a growing business over time. Very, very important. You know, I will say I myself am on the boards that I'm on are private company boards. That's by choice, meaning that I enjoy the level of engagement that I have as a private board director with regard to specifically strategy development. There is something to be said for those of you that are thinking about board roles to be really clear about kind of the level of engagement that you're looking for with regard to strategy development. Oftentimes, smaller companies present opportunities for board members to become more deeply involved in that aspect of the business, which I suppose is intuitive, but you might not be thinking about as you're reviewing different opportunities as they present themselves. Okay, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but this gives you a little deeper insight to kind of specifically how board focus is changing across strategy, risk oversight, ESG, cyber risk, and also human capital. And what you'll see is, you know, strong shifts in each of these areas. Again, moving from a historical kind of like rubber stamping version of what being on a board kind of historically looked like to the very real engagement that is required now. Okay, so to the point of risks, the model that you see on the right of this slide comes from the TCFD. It's actually a climate action-based model, but I use it and have used it many times over for things that aren't specifically climate related, in the sense that it's a really awesome framework to help companies think through both risks that are potential risks or that they're currently dealing with, and also how to translate that into opportunities. But I won't read this list. As you likely know from as being astute business people, there are a myriad of risks that companies face today. And the difference between getting caught flat-footed and turning those risks into opportunities is doing the deep thinking now. Do not wait for the crisis to be crisis ready. If we haven't figured that out right now, then, well, I guess we've got bigger problems. Okay, so I went really fast through that content, but I do want to make sure that each of you have time to ask the things that are on your mind with an appreciation for the vast diversity of attendees that we have. Some of you, no doubt, have deep experience in boards and maybe want to go more into how board expectations are changing. Maybe some of you are more curious about kind of the process of getting on a board. But as I set forth in the beginning of this hour, my goal for you is that at least you are walking away with a sense of how to lead knowledgeably, strategically, and effectively to achieve excellence in governance, whether that's in, as your future self or your current self. It's been my great experience and privilege to be on 3 high-functioning boards. I can say with true authenticity that in each of those cases, our collective contributions have led to much better outcomes than would have been the case without our participation. And it's my hope for each of you that you're able to have some of those experiences yourselves. One of the things that I didn't think about, but has been a gift along the way, is when you commit to being on a board, you also have the great opportunity to extend your network amongst your board peers and meet, interact, and form relationships with others that likely you would have never had the opportunity to do so. And so that is another thing to think about as you are either aspiring to be on a board or maybe just need to double down and cultivate those relationships on the boards that you find yourself on.
Lisa,
okay, so, yes.
I just wanted to remind you of time. So we're like, we have 20 more minutes. So hopefully
it's
we have enough
perfect
time.
Because we're just getting to the polling question. Thank you, Mariana.
Great.
Okay, so here's the deal. I know I flew through that content, but I want to get a sense from each of you in real time based on today's discussion. And maybe I should have waited till after the Q&A, but anyway, based on today's discussion, what is your interest level for continued education around governance excellence, right? The landscape is changing fast. You'll have about 20 seconds to let us know if you have increased, decreased, or, about flat interest in learning more about governance.
The poll is up and we're collecting responses. So let's give audience a few more seconds to answer. Okay, and we can close it now. So here are the results. 74% increase, 25% no change.
Okay, good. All right, well, that's
Zero decrease. We have 1% that is lost along the way, but decreased 0. So
yeah, okay, good. I mean, I will tell you, it's very satisfying work, and I wish I had the type of training, honestly, that I do now before I joined my first board, but that's okay. Hindsight 2020, you all can be the beneficiaries of that. So with that, let's move to Q&A.
And we have plenty of questions, so let's kick things off.
Sure.
Here's the first one. On pensions funds boards is usual to have members elected among participants. How to ensure those members have the necessary knowledge and experience? Regulations around the world require certification, but COVID-19 has shown that's not enough. Any thoughts about that?
Boy, there is a lot packed in there. Can I ask you to repeat it one more time?
Sure.
Yeah.
On pension funds boards, it is usual to have members elected among participants. How to assure those members have the necessary knowledge and experience. Regulations around the world require certification, but COVID-19 has shown that that's not enough.
Mm.
Any thoughts
This is,
about that?
well, I mean, I want to say first off, this is definitely not my depth of expertise. So I don't want to respond kind of, outside of that. But, I think just broadly speaking, what have we learned? We have learned that creativity and innovation is key to solving any problem in the time of crisis. So what I would recommend, not specifically to board work, frankly, is that you figure out a way to do a Cliff Note version of the training that you need, and leverage innovation in a way to effectively get it to the right people. And if anything, we've learned so much about even this setting right here, what technology can do to benefit us in this setting. So I would just say, get creative, be innovative, and leverage technology.
Perfect, thank you. Here's another one. I just turned 50 last week. I have a long and distinguished public sector professional experience. I have been on a number of nonprofit boards. How can I get noticed to serve on a corporate board?
It's a really great question. So I'll share with you a few things. I think that 2 data points. One is that traditionally board seats have been filled most through a company or the current board's own networks. Now, that's a bad thing in the sense that it has yielded, for the most part, homogenous boards, right? Like people recruiting like people. And what does that mean? That means that the role, with increased recognition and frankly pressure from stakeholders to change the diversity of boards, professional retained search companies or firms are becoming a bigger part of the equation of board recruitment, specifically what is termed the Shrek firms. I am not going to remember them all at the top of my head, but these are the big retained search firms. So Spencer Stewart as an example, Heidrick as another example. That's the S and the H. Don't make me get to the R and the E and the K. But typically 15%, 1/5 of all board searches were filled by retained search. That is increasing, and over the course of the last year has increased to closer to 25%. Why do I share that? I think both are important. So one, start cultivating relationships with those Shrek firms, making your intentions clear. Secondly, the network effect is real. And so as an example, joining organizations in the US anyway, such as the NACD, which is the National Association of Corporate Directors. There's another one, which is PDA, Private Directors Association. Joining, as an example, Silicon Valley Executive Center board readiness programs, like any opportunities that you have to engage with other current directors and organizations that are overseeing directorships certainly can pay off handily. And by the way, you'll learn a lot along the way as well.
Thanks, Lisa. Here's the next one. What's the best way to address the disconnect between the board and the day-to-day oversight of the chain of command? Who decides what and on what basis oversight, including the time lags and information to and from boards?
Well, I think, first and foremost, that culture piece is very important, right? So if there, one of the things that we didn't talk about, that I talk about when I do the Women's Corporate Board Readiness Program, is what diligence to do as a potential director with companies, what questions to ask. And a lot of that is with the intent of getting underneath the culture to understand, is there in fact a gap between the perception of a company and its leaders and the reality of employees? So if you're not already on a board that is experiencing that gap, asking probing questions is quite important. With regard to solving that gap, as a board director, you certainly have the potential, and I'll say responsibility, to fill in those blanks. And while it's actually not permitted that you would reach out to members of the team without kind of letting it be known, you certainly can do so to start to gain some of your own opinions with regard to the true goings on of the business. Frankly, that's part of the duty to care. I think there was a little bit in that question around kind of like better understanding what's being reported out and the accuracy of that, I think. And I would go back to duty of care there too. If you kind of like are sniffing out some incompatibilities with what you're hearing, ask probing questions. That's your job.
Perfect, thank you. Here's another one. Despite having clear guidelines on board responsibility in terms of attendance of meetings as well as fiscal fundraising responsibilities, our board is still not compliant. What advice do you have for approaching board members in a positive way, and who is best positioned to ensure compliance? Board chair, governance chair, staff.
That sounds like it might be a nonprofit related board. Well, actually, when I hear the fundraising part, I guess that's why that comes up, but I suppose it could be a startup that needs to do a capital raise. And I think, ultimately it is the chairperson's responsibility to hold the board accountable, period. There are a million different kind of nuances that come with that. But at the end of the day, to the person that asked the question, if you are seeing board members being held to inconsistent levels of accountability, it is the chairperson's responsibility to solve that. And as a member of the board, you can request that of the person.
Perfect, thank you, Lisa. Here's the next one. How much details, and here's one that is really specific for the first half of the webinar, how much details should be included in the minutes? Robert's Rules of Order say record what was decided, not what was said.
Yes, that's true. That's absolutely true. What was decided is just fine. In the boards that I'm on, we include a little bit more than that. So color on kind of if it is a key decision, if there are different points of view, we do include some of that. But you're absolutely right. The last thing that anyone wants to do is to pour over every last and but, right? So be judicious about the minutes. But I would recommend that someone on the board, in the boards that I'm on, we have a trained executive assistant that is solely responsible for keeping the minutes. She's been trained really through standards that are well known in public companies. And so if you don't have that, I would highly recommend it.
Great. Another one. Your slides have used the term cyber, but NACD and ISACA have started the transition to information security, with cyber IT being a component of that. Can you give your opinion on how to tailor information security credentials to potential boards?
Sorry, can you, I think I interrupted you. Tell me the last part of that question.
To give your opinion on how to tailor information security credentials to potential boards.
How to tailor, I'm not sure I fully understand.
Do you want me to repeat the full question?
Okay.
Maybe then.
Well, actually, one of the things I didn't talk about with regard to committees, we talked about the 3 SEC required committees for public companies, but what we didn't talk about is the way in which new board areas of focus are increasingly popping up. As an example, the formation of a tech committee is very common. I happen to lead one of those on one of the boards that I am on. And I would recommend in a business that has kind of a particularly deep orientation, whether from a risk or an opportunity, probably both standpoint, that you contemplate forming a tech committee. And that group of people, therefore, remains responsible for both oversight with regard to strategy and risk assessment, but very much importantly, to reporting back to the balance of the committee. This is an area too where certainly boards are putting an area of focus with regard to board recruitment. Many companies do not have the skills that they need in this way, and so having board expertise in this zone is very much sought after and can serve a company very, very well in taking shape in a committee.
Great. We have another one. How to square the U.S. legal focus on acting in best interests of shareholders narrowly versus a stakeholder approach?
Yeah, I mean, isn't this an important question, right? The shift in the zeitgeist from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. I don't think that there is any one answer. It's going to depend on the values orientation of the company and ultimately the ethos and purpose orientation of that company. I don't want to say it's a loaded question, but it's a really tricky question. I think companies that do this best with regard to making the transition are companies that have a very clear purpose and have backed that purpose with the clarity of strategy. And in doing so, I worked for Nike for 10 years. I think Nike is brilliant at this. And while obviously a publicly traded company has shifted to a meaningful form of stakeholder capitalism in its practices, which translates to strategy and ultimately results. So no clear answer, but if you don't know where your company sits on it, have a conversation at your next board meeting. I'm sure it will be robust. And the idea of stakeholder capitalism in this moment could not be more important.
Thank you, Lisa. We have more time for plenty of questions. Here's another one that touches diversity portion. What about diversity with respect to areas of expertise? It seems that many board members, regardless of race, gender, orientation, they either come from finance, operations, and so on. And also, why only Black and Latin? Why no Asian or East Indian communities? This touches that part of the presentation that we covered at the beginning.
Thank you. I love this question so much. So really important. I just touched on it in our last cyber/tech oriented question, but it is true that if we were to simply kind of scan the functional expertise of existing board members in the US, many reside in kind of like the finance operational type zones. And it is also true, as I've said just a second ago, that other forms of expertise are being heavily sought after, especially technology as an example. Also with regard to, I'll say those, I don't like the term human resources, so I'm going to call it chief people officers, but those that are deeply connected to the importance of social diversity and cultivating strong cultures in that way is another area that's also gaining traction with regard to specific expertise on boards. With regard to racial representation, certainly diversification in all sorts is important. To be clear, the reason that I talked about Black and Latin specifically is because there is legislation underway in Illinois that is working in support specifically of Black and Latin people. So that is why I said that specifically, and just wanted to be clear about that.
Here is another one. Have the boards you are on ever discussed directors and officers insurance for board members? Do you happen to have any results or concerns in relation to that?
Yeah, so D&O insurance, director and officers insurance is a must for any of you that, well, for all of you. Make sure if you're on a board, you have it. And if you're considering that being on a board, that the company also has it. When I teach the board readiness program, I go over a list of kind of due diligence and questions to ask. And one of those is certainly to be aware of the policies that the company has in place with regard to D&O insurance. I myself, in 2 out of 3 instances, it was all taken care of. In the third, I did have to probe and ask the question, and in the end, it was fine. But it took a little bit more sleuthing out in that particular instance. But never accept a board role until you're clear about the company's policy.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I think we have time for one more question, if you agree, and then
Sure,
we
go
can
for it.
wrap
Let's
it
wrap it up.
up. What is the difference between a board advisor for a privately held company and a board director?
Oh, yeah, it's a great question. So, and a lot of this is nuance and vernacular, but oftentimes in startups, the investors themselves make up the initial board, and then a founder might augment the expertise that they surround themselves with advisors. And oftentimes, certainly not always, but oftentimes those advisor roles eventually, if it's a good relationship and there's a value add there, may turn into board opportunities in the form of an independent director. So that is a nuance that is, of course, specific to the startup world. In other situations, although this wasn't the question, investors may be what's called a board observer, which means that they don't have voting rights, but because they have invested in the company, they want to be kept apprised of the progress. And so they therefore negotiate the opportunity to sit in on all board meetings in order to remain updated.
Excellent. Well, Lisa, I think there's a lot more questions to answer, but we certainly can address those in our follow-up. So I just wanted to thank you in the first place for an amazing webinar. It was really insightful and lots of great feedback, and we had a great audience as well with a lot of interest. So we'll make sure to address everything afterwards. Lisa, again, thanks. It was a pleasure, and I want to thank you all for a wonderful presentation, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. It was fun. I wish I could see your faces, but I'll assume they're smiling. Thank you so
Yes.
much. Have a good
Thank
balance
you.
of your day. Okay, bye.
Have a good one. Goodbye.
Bye.